On a blistering summer day in June 1876, General George Armstrong Custer, one of the most celebrated yet polarizing figures in American military history, led over 600 men of the 7th Cavalry into what he believed would be a triumph of audacity. Instead, it became a cautionary tale of hubris and overreach. What began as a march fueled by ambition and a thirst for glory quickly unraveled into one of the most catastrophic defeats ever suffered by U.S. forces. As the regiment traversed the plains of Montana, unaware of the thousands of native warriors lying in wait, Custer's fateful decision to divide his forces sealed their doom. The boldness that had once defined his career gave way to a tragic miscalculation, leaving his legacy forever scarred. What drove this renowned commander to such a devastating end? This is the story of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, a saga of arrogance, defiance, and the grave consequences of underestimating a determined enemy fighting for survival. Part 1. Tension and approach. The morning of June 25, 1876, dawned heavy with dust and foreboding. The 7th Cavalry, under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, pressed forward with unease, pursuing an elusive Indian village said to house thousands of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. The exact size and location of the settlement were shrouded in uncertainty, casting a shadow of dread over the advancing troops. As they neared the divide between the Rosebud and Little Bighorn rivers, the terrain itself seemed to embody the peril ahead. The divide, just a ridge in the landscape, stood as a symbolic threshold, a point of no return that loomed both physically and psychologically. Crossing it meant committing to battle, ready or not. Custer, driven by an unrelenting desire for glory, viewed the situation as an opportunity too grand to pass up. The vast plains stretched endlessly before him, a canvas on which he envisioned a decisive victory that would immortalize his name. Dreams of a heroic triumph over such a formidable native force danced in his mind, perhaps even opening the door to political aspirations. Yet beneath his bravado lurked an unease he refused to acknowledge. The scout's intelligence was contradictory, and the true strength of the enemy remained an enigma. Still, Custer pressed on, trusting in his instincts and convinced that surprise was his greatest ally. Lieutenant George Wallace, the chief of engineers, later chronicled the pivotal moment with an air of detachment. At noon on the 25th, we crossed the divide between the Rosebud and Little Bighorn. Though written as if it were merely a routine entry, the significance of that march was anything but ordinary. Every soldier knew they were advancing into the jaws of potential disaster. Captain Frederick Benteen, one of Custer's subordinates, voiced grave doubts about their course. He later recounted the ominous signs, a massive trail of Indians indicating an overwhelming force ahead. "We knew there were 8 or 10,000 Indians," Benteen remarked, the sheer scale of their foe casting a long shadow over the regiment's morale. The evidence scattered across the plains was undeniable. Abandoned teepees, smoldering campfires, and churned earth told of a colossal force just out of sight. As the regiment paused briefly between 10 and 10:30 a.m., the weight of the moment settled over them. The men, perched on weary horses, scanned the horizon with a mix of apprehension and resolve. Many attempted to focus on the mundane, sharpening weapons or adjusting saddles. But the oppressive sense of impending doom was impossible to ignore. Custer, seated astride his horse, surveyed the terrain with a practiced gaze. The vast landscape before him was eerily still, the distant ridges cloaked in an unsettling quiet. He had faced critical junctures before, both literal and figurative, and emerged victorious, but this time felt different. An unshakable unease lingered in the air, a warning unspoken yet unmistakable. As the regiment halted, Custer convened his officers for a final consultation. Among them were his brother, Tom Custer, Captain Benteen, and Major Marcus Reno. The atmosphere was tense, the gravity of their situation weighing heavily on each man. Decisions made here would dictate the fate of the 7th Cavalry and the legacy of its commander. Custer's confidence did little to quell the growing unease among his officers. He spoke rapidly, outlining his plan with a conviction that bordered on arrogance. They would cross the divide, press forward, and strike the village by surprise. His tone left no room for hesitation, but the seasoned scouts, particularly the respected Charlie Reynolds, were far less optimistic. They had seen the signs, vast trails, abandoned campsites, and evidence of a massive force, and knew the peril of underestimating such a formidable enemy. Reynolds, his voice laden with concern, described the largest gathering of Indians he had ever witnessed. Captain Frederick Benteen, known for his sharp wit and unyielding skepticism, openly questioned the plan. "Shouldn't we keep the regiment together, General?" he asked, frustration evident in his voice. "If this camp is as large as they say, we'll need every man we've got." But Custer, a man unaccustomed to entertaining dissent, dismissed the suggestion outright. "You have your orders," he replied curtly, his tone leaving no room for further debate. As the regiment remounted and advanced, the divide loomed ahead. The serene landscape of rolling hills and sunlit plains offered no hint of the danger that awaited beyond the horizon. The sun blazed mercilessly, adding to the soldiers' growing sense of weariness and apprehension. For many of the younger men, fresh from military academies, this was their first real taste of combat. The romantic notions of war that had lured them into the cavalry were quickly dissolving, replaced by the grim reality of the moment. By noon, the column reached the divide. Custer called for a brief halt, giving his men a chance to dismount and regroup. Officers took the opportunity to scan the terrain or confer quietly among themselves. The mood was heavy with unspoken fears, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on them. The divide, though merely a geographic feature, had taken on a symbolic weight. It represented the thin line between life and death, order and chaos, a point from which there could be no return. For Custer, the divide was a defining moment. He had faced such junctures before, and his audacity had always seen him through. But as the column crossed the ridgeline and descended into the unknown, the stakes had never been higher. They pressed forward, unaware that the village they pursued was far larger than expected. The intelligence they had relied upon was fragmented at best, and Custer's instincts, while often dependable, were leading him into the jaws of disaster. Crossing the divide marked a shift in the narrative of the campaign. What had been a bold march toward glory was becoming a march into infamy. At this moment, Custer remained the celebrated leader, a man whose victories had defined his career. His officers, though uneasy, still placed their trust in his judgment. Yet doubts lingered, creeping into their minds with every sign of the enemy's overwhelming numbers. The plains stretched endlessly before them, vast and unforgiving. The sun, now high in the sky, bore down relentlessly, draining the men and their weary horses of energy. Behind them, the divide seemed distant, a gateway to a past that felt irretrievable. Ahead lay an uncertain future, a future that would be written in blood. Custer, consumed by his belief in his own invincibility, pushed forward, retreat never crossing his mind. Nor did he consider consolidating his forces. He was resolute in his mission to strike a decisive blow, one that would etch his name into the annals of history. Visions of victory, glory, and accolades swirled in his mind. Yet with each step deeper into the vast wilderness, those dreams began to waver, overtaken by the oppressive reality of the unknown. The soldiers of the 7th Cavalry were now on a path from which there was no turning back. What lay ahead was a reckoning that none of them could foresee, a moment that would forever alter the story of the American West, a moment destined to end in tragedy. Custer, ever the optimist, dismissed the mounting evidence of peril. His unshakable confidence in his ability to lead his men to victory overshadowed the grim reality they faced. As the column descended the ridgeline, he urged his troops forward with unrelenting determination, eager to confront the enemy and reaffirm his dominance on the battlefield. But the signs of impending disaster were all too clear to the soldiers, scouts, and even some of the officers. They had observed the massive Indian trail, the remnants of abandoned villages, and the overwhelming scale of the force ahead. The tension was palpable, an almost tangible weight pressing down on them as they marched toward their destiny. When the last man crossed the divide, the 7th Cavalry was irrevocably committed. There was no turning back. The battle was now unavoidable, its outcome uncertain. For Custer, however, this moment brimmed with bold determination. The only thought that occupied his mind was victory. Yet, the divide they had just crossed was more than a physical boundary. It was a symbolic threshold marking the beginning of their end. Part 2, Battalion Division and Orders Crossing the Divide, was not merely a geographical transition, but a pivotal moment that sealed the fate of Custer and his men. In the cool late morning of June 25, 1876, the 7th Cavalry found itself at a crossroads, poised for what would become chaos, carnage, and catastrophe. After a brief halt atop the crest, separating the Rosebud and Little Bighorn rivers, Custer, emboldened by his unwavering faith in his own judgment, made the fateful decision to divide his forces into battalions. The decision, though consistent with his aggressive tactics, was met with silent unease among his officers. None dared to voice their objections aloud, knowing that Custer's confidence left little room for dissent. Throughout his career, he had relied on speed, surprise, and overwhelming force, strategies that had served him well in the past. But this time, his audacity edged dangerously close to recklessness. Custer's plan, based on incomplete intelligence, hinged on the element of surprise. He believed this would guarantee their success, despite the regiment's fatigue and their glaring numerical disadvantage. However, he grossly underestimated the sheer size and strength of the native force awaiting them, a critical miscalculation that would have devastating consequences. As the regiment regrouped after crossing the divide, Custer called a meeting with his senior officers. Major Marcus Reno, Captain Frederick Benteen, and others gathered around their commander, the weight of the moment evident on their faces. While the exact details of their discussion remained inaudible to the watching soldiers, the gravity of the decisions being made was unmistakable. The mood among the men was tense, like a taut string on the verge of snapping. Some soldiers distracted themselves by adjusting their gear or sharpening their weapons, while others stared blankly at the horizon, lost in their thoughts. The enormity of the Indian Trail they had followed weighed heavily on their minds. The village ahead was no ordinary settlement. It was a massive congregation of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, perhaps the largest ever assembled. Fewer than 700 men now prepared to march toward what many feared was certain doom. Custer, however, remained undeterred by such concerns. He exuded a confidence that bordered on arrogance, a trait that had long polarized those under his command. While some admired his fearlessness and conviction, others resented his hubris, deeply uneasy with his tendency to gamble with their lives. As Custer addressed his officers, his decision was resolute. They would proceed as planned. To him, the risks were irrelevant in the face of the potential glory. His unwavering belief in his own invincibility had carried him through many battles before. This time, however, it would lead his regiment into the jaws of disaster. The regiment was divided into battalions, with each unit assigned a critical role. In what Custer envisioned as a coordinated assault, Major Marcus Reno, a battle-hardened officer with years of experience, was entrusted with 3 companies, A, G, and M. His orders were explicit: lead his men along the left side of a narrow creek parallel to the valley, initiate a charge into the heart of the village, disrupt the encampment, and hold his position until reinforcements could arrive. Reno's bravery was undeniable, but unease gnawed at him. This mission felt different, larger, graver. The signs were unmistakable. The massive trails, abandoned camps, and overwhelming enemy numbers suggested a fight far beyond anything he had faced before. As he nodded to Custer's orders, trying to suppress his growing dread, he steeled himself for the perilous charge ahead. Captain Frederick Benteen, known for his sardonic wit and pointed skepticism, was assigned a separate mission. Leading companies D, H, and K, he was directed to scout the bluffs to the left of the main column. His task was to locate any Indian forces attempting to flee or outflank the regiment. As always, Custer's orders were aggressive. Benteen was to engage any opposition he encountered and report back if he discovered anything significant. Benteen's misgivings were evident. The plan, to divide their forces in the face of such a formidable enemy, struck him as reckless. The enormity of the Indian Trail they followed and the intelligence they had gathered left him certain that Custer was underestimating the strength of their adversaries. With his trademark smirk, he voiced his concerns. "Hadn't we better keep the regiment together, General? If this is as big a camp as they say, we'll need every man we've got." Custer's reply was terse, his tone brooking no argument. "You have your orders." The discussion ended there. Bristling with frustration but bound by duty, Benteen gathered his men and prepared for what he privately deemed a futile errand. He harbored little doubt that Custer's unwavering confidence was leading them into disaster. Meanwhile, Custer retained control of the main body of the regiment. Companies C, E, F, I, and L, along with the headquarters contingent, would follow his lead. He planned to take these troops down the right side of the creek, mirroring Reno's approach, to strike the village from another angle. Custer was confident that this division of forces would allow them to strike swiftly and decisively, catching the enemy unprepared and sowing chaos. His strategies had succeeded before, and he saw no reason to doubt them now. In the rear, Captain Thomas McDougal was given command of Company B and the pack train, which carried vital supplies, ammunition, and medical provisions. Though his assignment lacked the drama of the impending battle, it was critical to the mission's success. Without the pack train, the regiment would be unable to sustain any prolonged engagement. Ever reliable, McDougal accepted the responsibility with his usual steady resolve, aware of its importance. As the battalions prepared to move out, the mood among the troops was a mix of apprehension and anticipation. Some soldiers exchanged confident glances, buoyed by youthful bravado and eager for the fight ahead. Others, more seasoned and cautious, could not ignore the ominous signs they had encountered. The vast Indian trails, countless campfires, and abandoned village sites all pointed to a force far larger and more dangerous than anticipated. Private Giovanni Martini, one of Custer's orderlies, felt the tension radiating through the column. As he rode with his comrades, he noticed their nervous energy, the restless movements, the quiet murmurs, the darting glances toward the horizon. Even amidst the bravado, an unspoken fear hung in the air. The soldiers understood, on some level, that they were marching towards something far more perilous than they had ever imagined. Unfazed, Custer remained resolute, his confidence unshaken. For him, this was another opportunity to prove his mastery of the battlefield, to achieve glory that would cement his place in history. But for many of his men, the divide they had crossed was more than a physical boundary. It was a passage into the unknown, where fate would soon unfold in blood and tragedy. There was an uneasy restlessness among the men, a shared sense that something was amiss, though none dared to voice their fears. Private Martini felt the same gnawing anxiety, a weight in his stomach that refused to lift. Yet, like the rest, he pressed forward, bound by duty to follow their commander into the unknown. Lieutenant George Wallace, ever meticulous, recorded the unfolding events with precision, his observations destined to become one of the few reliable accounts of that fateful day. Wallace noted the battalion assignments being issued shortly after crossing the divide, with Custer delivering orders in his characteristic tone of unwavering confidence. Yet, Wallace himself could not ignore the somber finality hanging over the scene. Though unspoken, a creeping realization had taken root among the men. They were marching into a battle that might end in disaster. As the battalions prepared to move out, officers moved among their troops, issuing final instructions and making last-minute adjustments. The mood was grim, but a sense of determination prevailed. Each man knew the hours ahead would test their resolve in ways they had never encountered. Dust clung to their uniforms, kicked up by horses and pack mules, while the relentless heat bore down on them like a suffocating weight. There was no turning back. They had crossed the divide, both physically and metaphorically, and were now committed to whatever fate awaited them. The regiment moved out again, the columns spreading as they descended from the ridgeline into the valley below. Reno's battalion led the way, veering left as ordered, their tight formation cutting a cautious path along the creek. Reno bore the heavy weight of his assignment, forcing himself to focus on the mission despite his unease. A seasoned officer, he knew how to suppress his doubts, but the sheer scale of the challenge gnawed at his resolve. The enemy's numbers loomed large in his mind,